Hi, everyone. Welcome to MPP TV. This is Nick Brana, founder and national director with the Movement for a People's Party. And today I am happy, lucky, and glad to introduce Scott Santens, who is an international expert in universal basic income. Scott, I think you started in 2013 just studying universal basic income. You know, you've become a real force in the movement to implement one. And you run a number of websites now, including Basic Earth Income Network, right?
Oh, I don't run the Basic Income Earth Network, but I certainly direct people to it.
Well, you do have a couple of your own, I know. I know one of them is your website, Scott Santens,
Mhm.
and then you started Basic Income Today just recently. Uh,
Yep, just launched Basic Income today.
oh, is that just today?
No, just launched Basic Income today,
Okay, gotcha.
last week.
I see. Well, yeah, it's a great source as well. And so, Scott, it's in our platform, Universal Basic Income, and I wanted to take this opportunity too to give you a chance to tell people why you think that it is the future, why you think that it's necessary. You know, what are the benefits? It's been around for a long time, as I said in the description. One of the things that's most interesting about Universal Basic Income is how much intellectual diversity there is among its supporters, from Friedrich Hayek, all the way on like a libertarian end, to Martin Luther King Jr., to Thomas Paine. So incredible range of support, and I'd love to hear why you think that is and how you think it's applicable today in modern times.
Yeah, so if I were to try to explain why it's so ideologically diverse, I mean, what it really comes down to are basic needs, like access to basic resources. So it's like, can you imagine people on both sides who think that people should be able to eat? Well, yeah, like everybody can agree that people need to eat to live. What we disagree on are like what you need to do to eat, say what conditions there should be on that. And traditionally, it's been, we have I would say a fetish, but it's like a moralistic zeitgeist going on where you know, since the forever, not forever, but say forever since, let's say around agricultural times, um, it's been essentially that we have to work to eat. And I think that really kind of what it gets down to is the core of this is I think that unconditional basic income is about really trust. What it comes down to is society saying that we trust each other. I would think that I would say that money itself is kind of like this. It's a tool of trust. You're like you have like this little piece of paper, and you walk up to some total stranger, and you give them this paper, and they will actually give you all sorts of stuff that they have or services that they do. It's like they will do something for strangers for this piece of paper. So it's like we all trust in this tool that we use called money. And so it really gets down to the core of that. And I think that the reason it's so important is I think I would go all the way back to Thomas Paine, and I really like Thomas Paine's argument, and I suggest that people really just read it in his own words, like Find Agrarian Justice by Thomas Paine, and read it. And one of the great quotes from that is he refers to this as it's not a charity that he's talking about. It's a right, and that the state of civilization is as odious as it is unjust. And the reason that he says that is because his framing is that the earth itself belongs to everyone. Like we were all born here. No one created the metals or the oil or the force or these things. Like it's all there. And what we do is we kind of, we dig this stuff up out of the ground. They say minerals, we turn it into stuff. But like, so who owns it? Well, traditionally, we're saying right now that the people who dig it up out of the ground and mix their value with it own it, and no one else owns anything. And Thomas Paine is saying that no, if you claim something from the natural earth, if you claim that as yours, then you essentially owe compensation to everyone else who no longer can lay claim to that. So it's like we created this civilization, and I would say we created it without this foundation. And so Thomas Paine, at the very beginning of our country, was talking about laying this foundation, saying that we need to look at property itself differently, and that people actually deserve this share of natural resources. And we create all these great things the way that we do things, but at the same time, as we create this, we are actually essentially stealing from each other by not compensating them for their natural rights. So like really the closest thing to this anywhere is in Alaska, where they say, look, we're going to dig this oil out of the ground, but Alaskans own it. It's not the that's not the oil companies. They don't just get to own it. They have to pay a fee for it. And so it's just saying that hey, you have to pay for this natural resource, and everyone should benefit from that. And we should look at this beyond just that. There's so many other natural resources that are shared amongst us that we could say the same thing about. And there's also collectively created resources that we could say the same thing about. Like the value of land increases because of everyone adding the value to it. Like intellectual property, that's something that we give value to. So it's like we need to change the way that we look at these things, and I think UBI really helps with that. It makes us see that we should actually have some amount of access to to basic needs provided to everyone, and then on top of that foundation, we can then build a society that's where people are more secure. They're less ruled by fear. They're able to think long term versus short term. They're able to pursue the interests that they are most interested in. They're able to say no to people who would coerce them. They're able to say yes to things that they would want to do. Poverty is decreased, inequality is decreased. There's just so many things that emanate from this. It's there's all these emergent outcomes that come from unconditional granting of access to basic resources, and that's what basic income is. And as we go towards into this future where we are automating more and more things, and I think that's a good thing, but we're stuck in this paradigm where we need money to live and we require jobs for money, in which case we're afraid of losing these jobs. And like we're actually seeing people call for full employment in response to automation. And I think that's exactly backwards. I think that as we actually increase our technology, that we should be setting this goal of full unemployment. We should be saying that, we'll never reach that goal, but we should go towards that. Like we should actually, if a machine can do a job that especially people don't want to do, then a machine should do that job. If we had the technology to automate something and free someone to do what they most want to pursue, we should do that. And we should set a goal of actually reducing the amount of time that we work. That we used to work 60, 70 hours per week. Kids used to work. That used to be a normal thing. We had to outlaw child labor. We had to actually make this shift from 60 hours to 50 hours to 40 hours. And here we are 48 hours, and we need to shift to 30 hours and 20 hours. Like we should go back to try to regaining more of our time for ourselves. And that's really part of what we need to do, and part of what UBI enables us to do is to kind of reflect on what work is, what technology, like the goals of technology, what should it be, what should the goals of our society be? And these are like big questions, and I think that basic income really helps reach those.
Yeah, there are some questions that really emerge, from what you're saying and from modern kind of dynamics, like the fact that we've had in the United States what progressives are very attuned to as this increase in productivity that has not been seen matched by an increase in wages, in standards of living. We actually in the United States have a declining longevity now in the US. And so, clearly there is a real issue of the distribution of resources. And one of the reasons that we decided when we created our platform as MPP to incorporate universal basic income into it is because it goes into that next frontier of human advancement, which is economic rights, which you touched on, which is acknowledging that people don't necessarily, Franklin Roosevelt, for example, said it, that, that it has become apparent that social rights are insufficient to give people a good life in modern times. Instead, it's become clear that a second Bill of Rights, economic Bill of Rights, is necessary in the United States. And universal basic income is one of the things that could serve, as part of that second economic Bill of Rights as that foundation. And on top of that, you have things like the world is so different from when Thomas Paine, advocated for universal basic income. Since but back in his time, 80% of American society was agricultural. 80% of the workforce is agricultural. As agriculture has been automated since then, there's been an immense transition. There was a transition at the turn of the 19th century into industrial labor, and that became the bulk of the workforce in the United States and the Western world. Now that has transitioned as a result of automation and some outsourcing over to service labor, and now we're automating service labor to an immense degree, and so I think it'd be really interesting because you have so much insight into this, you've followed this for a long time. Could you tell us kind of about the state of automation today and the predictions that exist and the kind of the impact that's going to have?
Yeah. So I guess first of all, too, I just want to say it's really interesting to think about the fact that if you look back to Thomas Paine and think about the fact that we could have afforded it back then, based purely on like agriculturalism, like we had this agrarian economy and we could have done it then. So it's just, I think it's silly to me when here we are with all this advanced technology and people are still like debating if we can afford to do it. It's like, of course we can. All this is a choice. It's just a matter of will, collective will as a society saying that we should do this. This is where we should direct our resources. And this is like the kind of economic rights, that we should recognize. And so the state of automation is really interesting how a lot of this conversation is around like dangers of the future. And so one, again, I dislike the fact that we are considering technology as a danger. To me, it's a giant red flag that we've organized our society wrong, where work-saving labor is actually be seen as a scary kind of destructive force. It shouldn't at all be. We just need to make the right decisions to make it a constructive, liberatory, emancipatory force. But this is not a conversation that's only about in the future. This has been happening for decades. And of course, you can argue all the way back to centuries as far as technology goes. But as far as like computer technology, the effects of this on the labor market has been happening for decades. And as you mentioned, it was back in the 70s where you saw this great decoupling where productivity kept going up and wages completely stagnated. So over time, we've been becoming more and more and more productive. And yet most people are not better off. Those at the very top are getting the vast majority of this growth, especially in the top 20% really are the only ones getting it. Everyone else isn't. And really part of this goes to the fact that technology is having these effects. So if you go back decades where we first started automating, say, a lot of manufacturing work in the cars sector, that makes sense too, because robots have to be essentially effective enough. They have to be able to do the work, and routine work works really well for automation. And also the work has to be expensive enough in order to automate it. Like you're not going to automate work, no matter how easy it is, if some human being will do it for $1 an hour. But if a human being requires, $80,000 a year to do that job, and the machine costs $70,000 a year effectively, then you're going to automate. So what we did is we started automating in the manufacturing sector, and we started coring out those jobs in the middle. And that's been expanding. It's kind of like this growing hole where you can't automate the most skilled stuff yet because it requires the most skill. Or maybe it's not routine, maybe it's more difficult. And only now with deep learning are you able to start getting at this non-routine labor. But as technology becomes more capable, it can do more of that. And at the bottom, where let's say you've got a lot more routine stuff, but human labor is really cheap, that's where it depends on the cost of the machine. So say a machine that is effectively a laborer that's $20 an hour, you're not going to replace people working $15 an hour. But as soon as you have a machine working $10 an hour, then you absolutely can replace a lot of people working for $15 an hour. So there's that intersection going on that we're really just starting to see now, and that's kind of new, at least on the lower end of the spectrum, where actually the cost of automation has actually fallen below the cost of labor. So part of this is, besides that coring out at the middle, you're also seeing a skills polarization where really we've been eliminating those jobs in the middle and mostly creating low-skilled jobs because we are forcing people, there's not really the choice to not go back into the labor market, so you have to find something. And those are the jobs that we're creating, are these low skill and also mostly low wage jobs. And then at the high end, there's some really nice new jobs being created that pay quite a bit. They require a lot of skill. But those jobs are really productive because they're being leveraged. They're leveraging technology too. So you're not seeing as many of those. You're seeing some. There are absolutely some jobs being created, but there are a lot of jobs being eliminated, and they're being replaced by a lot of mostly not good jobs. And so here we are looking at kind of that impact right now. And we're also seeing this shift in really the compilation of jobs themselves. So it's almost like it was a temporary historical anomaly where jobs were really starting to become like a 9 to 5, 40 hours per week with benefits and all these stuff with it, and securities and job security, and the fact that you would have this for like 30 or 40 years or something. You could work at one place. And now that's like becoming more and more unheard of. Now most jobs, like the overwhelming number, almost 100% of jobs created from 2005 to 2015 were these forms of alternative work. So this is temporary jobs, part-time jobs, contract labor, freelancing, all these non-traditional jobs. These are really the new kind of work that people are seeing. And so then that gets into too, where it's not just the fact that you're employed that matters, right? Much more goes into this. It matters how much you're earning, how interested and engaged are you in that work? Do you feel good about that work? Does it feel like a social good, or does it feel like you're hurting people? What are the benefits from it? What is the security that it provides you? What are the hours involved? How many jobs do you have to have? So it's not, let's say it's confusing and not accurate to look at, say, the employment numbers and see like, oh, employment rate is traditionally, it's very, very low and most everyone's employed. The unemployment rate is only 3 or 4% or something. That's great news. That's not the only thing you can focus on. You have to focus on all these other details. And so essentially the labor market has been actively getting transformed over the past decades, greatly because of technology, but also because of our decisions as a society politically. And our safety nets, our social safety nets, are not designed for this. It's designed around this old version of work for employment that no longer exists and is not going to regrow. This is where we're going, is this new form of work. And we have to recognize that reality with a reformed safety net that's built to actually support and enable these new forms of work, and also the forms of work that we don't especially appreciate. We need a safety net for all unpaid workers. We should actually enable unpaid work. We want people to pursue whatever it is that they most want to pursue. And so many problems would be solved if people could actually refuse to work in a coercive way. If you can demand that someone pay $20 an hour for you to do that job, then suddenly you are not this exploited worker that you are right now when you need that money to live. So that's really what comes down to a lot of the crux of this, is that by being afraid, by fearing releasing people through this unconditionality, through this unconditional money to pursue, whatever's most important to them, including not to work, including the right not to work, then we are essentially forcing people to work, and all these other unintended consequences really fall out of that.
Yeah, and some people. One of the things that strikes me too is that is how you set it up. So there's a lot of different ways of setting up universal basic income. And some people have this impression that the only way to set it up is by eliminating the existing social safety net, or that's kind of the intention, that politicians would try to manipulate it that way. So what is your understanding of universal basic income? Do you, what kind of version of it do you support, specifically in terms of, the amount that you would provide, the kind of unconditionality, whether it would be traded for existing social safety net programs? What do you support? And, what is the movement in general? What is it gravitated towards?
Yeah, well, it's hard to say what the movement is gravitating towards. I guess I would say, if anything, it's more of an amount, and universality, I guess, is something that most people can agree upon. But yeah, when it comes to the actual design, as far as programs to replace and taxes to apply, and it's a huge discussion to have, and that's going to require really moving to, is basic income a good idea, to, of course it's a good idea. Let's figure out what's the best way of doing it. Both say best as in outcome, but also best as in politically achievable. You can argue that there's a certain best way to do it, but is that actually possible within our current system? So best can also mean, what is the most achievable way of doing this? But as far as like my personal kind of preferences, I think really the extremes on both ends are, I think, incorrect. If you're on the far right, or conservative kind of end of the spectrum, and you're wanting to get rid of like everything, and it's like you somehow believe that cash can do everything and it works best for everything, well, then you're wrong. Like, cash can do a lot of great things, and markets can do a lot of great things, but they can't do everything because markets don't exist everywhere. Like, healthcare is a great example, where healthcare has proven that it's just not a market in the traditional sense. That a market for healthcare will never truly exist where people are competing for these, services. It's the idea that, if you get a heart attack, that if you have a heart attack, you're not going to look in the phone book, or you're not going to Google to try to figure out what hospital nearby has the best, cheapest services. Right. It's not working in that way. So you do need certain non-cash services, and those are most efficient through the government. But then on the other end, on the far, say, left side of the spectrum, there's a belief that the government is working right now, and that's also the best possible way of doing certain things, and it's not. The safety net is full of holes. The people are able to fall through that, and people are able to miss the net entirely. If you look at the amount of people in poverty right now in the country, so overall, you're looking at over 40 million people in poverty in the U.S., and 13 million people in poverty are completely disconnected from the safety net. They're not getting anything. So this condition that we have, these conditions that we apply, exclude so many people. And that's the problem that the left needs to confront and deal with. Fear to do that too, where there's a fear that says, like, oh, well, if we admit that these programs are not actually working in the way that we think they are, then we'll be admitting that we were wrong or something, that they were a bad idea. And that's not necessarily the case. Like, you do need to help people. It's just we're not helping them in the best way possible. And they're having counterproductive consequences. Like, if you look at, say, disability assistance. Now, I don't want to eliminate disability assistance at all. But I do think it's important to realize that the way that disability assistance is designed is that you create these cliffs where you're essentially locking people out of the labor market, and you're saying that you can't earn money because you are too impaired to do so. So we're going to give you this money on a monthly basis. And if you earn too much, if you earn, say, $2,000 per month on top of it, then you lose it because obviously you're not disabled because you're earning money. So it creates these traps where you can't get out of it. And you're essentially saying to people on disability that they're not allowed to earn additional income without being punished for it. And that doesn't make any sense to me. So if you combine these things and you say, okay, let's make sure that everyone has this unconditional basic income floor of, say, $1,000 per month. Well, now, instead of, say, right now where disability, 1 out of every 5 people with a disability receives some form of disability assistance, then with that floor, 5 out of 5 do. Like, you don't miss 4 out of 5 people with a disability like you do now. So everyone has that floor. And then you provide an additional amount on top of that floor. So, right now, instead of someone getting $1,500 in disability income, they could get $1,000 plus $500 to match that exact same amount. And even if that was that same, they would still be better off, because now instead of falling to zero, if they lose that income, they fall to $1,000. And also they're able to earn money on top of it without losing that $1,000. So I think that we need to recognize that we are missing a floor, and we have to construct that. And we can construct that out of programs that we have right now that make sense to entirely replace with the floor. There are programs that we should partially replace with the floor. There are programs that we should not touch at all, and they should actually exist entirely on top of the floor. And there are also, there's welfare within the tax code that we don't even see as being like these welfare benefits when they're for the middle class and the rich. Like, it's crazy. $1.5 trillion per year are provided in tax expenditures. We spend $1.5 trillion per year in tax expenditures, and 17% of that income goes to the top 1%. So we're giving a lot of money to the 1%. And what we could do instead is say, hey, let's not do that, and let's actually use that revenue and build that into the floor that we provide to everyone. So it's not only about welfare reform, but it's also about tax reform, I believe, as far as the optimal way of going about a basic income distribution. And then, of course, we get into what are the best ways to fund it, as far as, taxes, looking at how we create money, say, looking at forms of taxes like land value taxes or construction or consumption taxes, or, you have like value added taxes, carbon taxes, financial transaction taxes. Like, there's a lot of different revenue mechanisms that we can look at. And I think some make sense more than others, but also some are more politically viable than others. Like something like a land value tax. I really like the idea of a land value tax, but it's one of those things, like if you were to do it nationally, then it would require a constitutional amendment. And so that's one of those things where we could do that state by state. So like, say, Washington state could have the Washington dividend based on land value tax, but doing that nationwide would be so much more difficult. So it's these kinds of things that also should go into the discussion of what are the best mechanisms and what are the best as far as like national versus state. And, we can even do this from the city too. And they can stack as well. So you can have a national basic income with a state basic income on top of it and a city basic income on top of that. So there's a lot of flexibility, and there's a lot of things we can do as far as designing what I think would be, the best basic income.
Yeah. Can you talk briefly about what the benefits have been too? There's been a lot of experiments. There's been experiments going back years, and so what have those experiments revealed about what the what the results are, in people's lives. And to what extent do you think that it has been comprehensively studied in the first place at all?
Yeah, there's just a lot of really interesting evidence out there. And so I suggest anyone listening, to go to my Twitter account and see my pinned tweet where I basically just keep like an ongoing thread of evidence that I put in there that I found. But there's a lot. And that's actually one of the reasons that got me into this too, where, I'm not just like ideologically inclined. I didn't just come to this and go, oh, we need this. This is like, an economic right and this is important and it doesn't matter. Nothing else matters. We should do this. Like, really a big part of this was I looked at the evidence and I had no idea that we had done experiments in the 70s as far as guaranteed income. I didn't know at the time that we had done this in like Seattle and Denver, and we did this in Gary, Indiana, and New Jersey. Like, we did experiments in the U.S. across the country during the 70s.
It almost passed.
Yeah.
And it passed the House of Representatives, the overwhelming vote. It was under Nixon's administration, and it died in the Senate because the Democrats wanted to higher universal basic income, and that was for the poor.
Yeah, it died. So part of it was the left was to blame, the left in the Senate because they wanted a higher amount, but also the right in the Senate was guilty because they were worried about the idea of women having too much freedom and those divorce rates growing up, and that would hurt the patriarchy kind of system. We can't have women having too much freedom. That was the thinking back then. But also another interesting element of this too is that it was tied in with the violence going on in the urban areas. And so once the violence subsided, there was at least, as the theory goes, that Nixon was less interested in pushing for this because it didn't seem like as dire emergency kind of situation. Whereas if it had continued, maybe he would have pushed it even and pushed those people on the Senate to do this. But that's a whole other interesting thing. But so those experiments in the 70s that happened, also in Canada. This was in Dauphin, Manitoba, was a saturation site where essentially like an entire city eliminated poverty for about 5 years. So that was really interesting. One of the big effects from there was that it reduced hospitalization rates by 8.5%. It also reduced, household violence against women went down by about a third. There's, stress went down. There's a lot of, also, it was interesting how, education rates improved. Like, people who had dropped out of high school in the Canada experiment actually went back to graduate to the point where the rates exceeded 100% because you had people who had left who were coming back. And so that was an incredible outcome too, to see, this on education. But then there's been the Alaska dividend that has existed since 1982, can teach us a lot of interesting things.
Like the longest going longitudinal study, you could treat it that way.
Yeah. And it's still revealing new things from people looking at that and go, what else can we learn from this? Like, one of the more interesting recent things was a really interesting study where they essentially created like what they call it a synthetic Alaska. And what they wanted to see what the effect was of the dividend specifically on work since the distribution started in 1982. And so, well, how do you compare that? What's your control group? There is no control group. So they created a control group synthetically using other states to combine those together and try to figure out something that would be very similar to an Alaska that never started the dividend, so they can compare it with the Alaska that started the dividend. And so that in itself is a really interesting design. And from looking at that, they found that there was no net impact on full-time employment. They found that there was a slight decrease in full-time employment from people reducing their hours, but there was also an increased employment from new jobs being created and people being able to take those jobs that wouldn't exist otherwise. So there was no net effect on full-time employment, but there was a 17% increase in part-time employment. So this showed that, this created more demand and thus more jobs, and then people were more able to actually do these part-time jobs because they're like, hey, I don't want a full-time job in addition to what I'm doing, but I could do a part-time job. And also that kind of thing is traditionally disincentivized through, I would say, conditional welfare because of the fact that you really need enough of an income from the employment you accept in order to be better off accepting employment. So that's another thing. And so then we did there was the Namibia UBI experiment, and there was the India UBI experiment, and the Give Directly UBI experiment is going on for 12 years. That started a few years ago, and that's ongoing. And there's interesting stuff coming out of there. And you've got some interesting things that you can look at, like from Iran did what was like very similar to a basic income, because it's provided like a universal cash grant that was really effectively high enough to be called a basic income, and it was provided to 96% of the population at one point. So there's been research that looked at that. Again, they didn't find any effect on work, but they also found like effects on self-employment as far as increasing, and effects for businesses and women getting into the employment. And I just want to say too, as far as self-employment goes, that's one of those things that I find universally. So there are certain effects that I just see over and over and over again, and self-employment is one of those. And it always seems to increase, and sometimes to great degrees. In Namibia, self-employment increased by 301%. So it effectively like quadrupled. In India, in the villages given basic income, they were 3 times as likely to start a new business than control villages. So you see this large effect there, and you've seen that effect elsewhere. And another effect that's practically universal as well that I've noticed is healthier birth weights. And this is due to better maternal nutrition. So, pregnant women who would usually not be able to eat as well or as securely or as sufficiently with the basic income, with this cash dividend, they're able to eat better. And thus, when they give birth, the kids are born healthier weights, and then those will lead to healthier outcomes throughout life. So there's a lot out there, and I could talk about like the effects observed for like hours. There's so much to talk about.
I know you could.
But I can tell you that there's just a lot, and it's all extremely positive, and it's just fascinating to look at. So I just suggest anybody really seek that out.
So I've got some questions from the comments, and some of the most common questions that I'm seeing are, what about the issue of inflation? So is a universal basic income inflationary? So I'll have you talk about that first, and then discuss another idea which is often referenced in conjunction to a universal basic income, and that's the jobs guarantee.
Sure.
So, yeah, tell us about the inflation first.
Okay, yeah. So it's funny. Like these two questions, I could talk for like an hour for each one. So to really simplify this down, so the inflation question, I as a shortcut, anyone who is curious about the inflation question, just Google basic income inflation and my name. And you'll find my article that I go into this in depth, and I break down like a whole lot of different variables that people need to look at in order to get into this, discussion. Just on a simple matter, I'd say no, basic income is not inflationary, especially to the degree people think it is. For the most part, and so the first thing to understand is that most UBI designs are not about creating new money and then distributing that to everyone. It's a matter of taking existing money and circulating that through the economy, throughout, instead of being stuck at the top. So it doesn't expand the monetary supply, in which case it doesn't mean that there are more dollars chasing the same amount of goods. And that's traditionally what is believed to cause inflation, is that there's just more and more money and no difference in what's available to purchase. So this actually uses the same amount of money supply to just make sure that it's in the hands of people who are spending it. And that can have inflationary effects, but it's not to the degree that people think it is. So another aspect of this is that you're not expanding the money supply. And another aspect of this is that there's still competition. So it's like there's this belief that says, okay, well, what's stopping a business owner from, say, charging $10 for a gallon of milk because they know that everyone has $1,000 more per month, right? Well,
Yeah, or rents are typical.
right.
That's the typical question.
Yeah. So what's stopping the person from raising the cost of milk is that there are other people who are selling milk, and you will basically or problematically go out of business if you do that. Now you have to have actual, price monopolies and people working together, and in order to price fix and these kinds of things, in order to get away with that.
Those often do exist, though.
They can exist. So it's not like
deal with those.
Not like it doesn't exist, but also we're in an age of Amazon as well. So you can get a whole lot of things from Amazon, and they really are just constantly undercutting everybody else. So this just stuff is getting more cheaper and cheaper thanks to them. And you can even, they just announced recently they're able to give like 1 day service to I think it's like 70 something percent of the country, down from 2 day service. So it's like there's a constant drive to decrease prices, become more efficient, as long as there is competition. And not only is there competition, but also competition is enhanced because, again, the entrepreneurship effect from basic income, where people can they're more able to start up businesses to compete as well, which I think is another kind of interesting thing. Now, when it comes to rents is also an interesting thing to look at, because right now, part of the reason that gives landlords so much power to raise rents is that people really don't have the power to say no. Like you have to live where you need to live, especially if your job is there. So when you decouple income from work, then that actually relieves that pressure too, because if you want your money to go further and you're not tied to your specific geographic region, then you're more able to move to lower cost of living areas throughout the country. In which case, you're basically introducing competition between landlords in high cost of living areas and low cost of living areas, to a degree that competition doesn't exist right now. So I'm not saying that it eliminates entirely the ability for landlords to raise rents, but it does actually introduce downward pressure on that compared to now. And another way that it puts downward pressure as well is that it increases the ability to buy homes. And that was an observed effect from the income maintenance experiments in the 70s, actually, was that they observed that, and quite interestingly, confusingly to the researchers, was that they found a 4 to 6% increase in home ownership through this cash that they provided. And they didn't expect that at all, because why would you buy a house that you wouldn't buy otherwise if you only were going to get this income for 5 years? It doesn't make any sense to sign up for a 30-year mortgage if you only have this temporary income. But it still had that effect. So if you look at that, it seems likely that you're going to see a larger increase than what was observed there for people buying houses, and thus decreasing pressure, because they're their own landlords now. Landlords have less power when they're not, the only ones in the game. People can afford their own homes. So that goes to the rent equation part. But then there's other things as well, as far as
there are issues most of the economy today, the modern economy, is organized into a series of oligopolies, like telecoms, for example, who've carved up the country. Sometimes there's only a single telecom available to millions of people across the country. And so they obviously distort and bastardize any kind of notion of free market by just getting together, deciding which territories, or price fixing, simple price fixing. And that happens across the economy in many different sectors now. And so, that's a problem that we confront whether we have universal basic income or whether we don't have universal basic income. But I wonder what you'd say to that.
Yeah, so that's a good example of, there are problems that can be, say, somewhat decreased or lessened or somewhat relieved by basic income, but it doesn't mean that they go away, and it certainly doesn't mean that we as citizens are free from doing what we need to do as citizens to fix those problems. So like when it comes to telecoms, like we as citizens need to really make sure that we gain more control over these things, that we're saying that, look, we need more competition between these telecoms, and also we should be able to, as I say, a city, introduce internet on the local basis. Then it's like a public-owned internet. And they have that in a few places. And that's one of the interesting things too about basic income that I think is like a second order or third order, kind of effect, is when, as a citizen, you are more able to engage politically. You can, say, volunteer your time to help a candidate win. You're more likely to be able to be a candidate. You can spend time on, phone banks, and you can knock on doors, and, you can really engage as a citizen to a greater degree. Again, this is an example of valuable unpaid work. And also like just the effect of what we're seeing like on voting behavior, where, if you're afraid that you might get fired, then, there are people who are skipping going to vote because they don't want to, end up to work late and possibly lose their job. And so there's this fear that comes from the need to get money to live that feeds into a lot of our other problems. And it's not saying that it causes all of these, but it's like, it's something that underlies a lot of these issues, where if you just fix that and remove that fear and enabled people in a way that they're not enabled, then you could really, improve a lot of different factors all at once. And so let's see. So to get back to the inflation stuff, I guess I would just, not to get too, go on and on and on, but another important aspect is
because I do want to ask you about the job
velocity of money. Okay, sure. So I just want to say the velocity of money is very low right now. And so there's an inflationary effect of money that moves hands quickly. But right now it's really, really low. So we shouldn't be worried about that. And also we are below our productive capacity. And we actually want to push our productive capacity upwards because that's good for productivity. And we can achieve more with less if we do that. And right now we're below that. So we want to go up there. As far as a job guarantee goes, as the next thing.
It's often it's often posited as for some reason being in opposition to a universal basic income. That mentality, it doesn't really make sense to me. I think they have different advantages. They serve somewhat different purposes, and they're very complementary. And I don't see a necessity to choose. I think that's kind of superfluous. And there's a notion too that a universal basic income, all policies can be contorted. They can be twisted away from their mission, from the original vision. And a universal basic income, could, in the worst scenarios, be used as a pretext to destroy a social safety net. Okay, but that's ancillary. That's been added to the universal basic income. You've added a negative effect to it. That is not the universal basic income in and of itself. I mean, the same thing can be said of almost any policy. A job guarantee could be used to just force people into more corporate, kind of servitude and corporate welfare. And so it all comes down to, and this is the reason, for the Movement for a People's Party, is that you need political integrity behind whoever's designing these policies.
Sure.
And none of the policies, but in and of themselves, are a solution without people who have the intent to design them to help people in the first place. Otherwise they get contorted in these ways. But yeah, I mean, I definitely want to hear what you have to say about a federal jobs guarantee in comparison.
Yeah. So yeah, I agree with a lot of that what you just said there. I would say that when it comes to basic income, one of the interesting things to focus on, it needs to be unconditional. I mean, that's the most important aspect, is that it's unconditional. So like worst case scenario of like eliminating the safety net, you still have this unconditional guarantee that doesn't exist. So it's like, I can imagine things getting worse potentially, but also even in that condition, so many other people would also be better off. So I don't see it having the same kind of, like people fear like this bad, evil version of basic income. And I just don't see it that way. I think there are better ways of doing it than others. When it comes to a job guarantee, I am worried about a job guarantee because effectively the important aspect of it is the guarantee. You're saying that you are guaranteed a job no matter what. Like even if the job doesn't need to exist, it's guaranteed to be there. Like you can, no matter what, choose to have a job. Well, doing what? And is it necessary? And is it efficient? Is it leveraging technology? Um, I think that it's a step in the wrong direction that we need to go because again, we want technology to work for us. And if we start to look at jobs, if we look at like the disappearing of jobs and our answer is to create more of them, then I think that there's something wrong with that. I think that we're stuck in this paradigm of that we need money to live, we need work for money, and therefore we should just create more work instead of disconnecting that and saying, no, we don't need more work. We should stop making people work for money and just make sure people have money and then they can decide their own work. And so that's really what I'm worried about with a job guarantee. But I am not against jobs programs being on top of a basic income. Like there is a lot of work that we need to do. There is so much work that needs to be done, especially in infrastructure and especially in energy infrastructure. Like when it comes to like the Green New Deal, we absolutely should be focused on transitioning as soon as we possibly can to a sustainable economy. And so we need to make these investments in solar and wind power. We need to update our electrical grid. Like there's a lot of work to do. And in which case we can effectively make something that, I wouldn't call it a job guarantee, but we could say, there's a lot of work to be done. And so there's so much work to be done that most people can get that job doing that work. That's great. But I think the focus needs to be on the work being done and not the fact that you're creating a job to give people money. Like those are two different things. And I think that we need to, focus on that difference. Like, Milton Friedman had a comment before that I think kind of got at this where, you're looking at a bunch of, say, big construction work going on with, the big backhoes and stuff. And they're like, well, so why are so many workers here? It's like, well, it's a jobs program. It's like, well, if it's jobs you want, then just give people, spoons instead of shovels. Like it's this idea. If we're focused on jobs, we're not focused on the tasks that we should be doing. And we have so many tasks that need to get done. That's what I want to focus on. And so, the Green New Deal, great. But I think that the unconditional basic income needs to exist underneath that, because part of this also needs to be de-leveraging from this unsustainable economy that we have right now. Like there's so many jobs that exist right now that don't need to exist. There was a worldwide, there was a survey done covering 100,000 workers, and they found that people that felt that their job either didn't need to exist or they were doubtful of its importance or its need to exist was around 25%. So basically, that's a really high amount of people with jobs right now who are potentially doing work that does not need to exist, which means that they're driving in their cars to and from offices, doing stuff that doesn't need to be done. And of course, that creates jobs that don't need to be done, because then you need, like, say, you have a whole office full of people doing jobs that don't need to exist. And then you have to have, the janitorial staff for those workers. So it's like that work needs to exist, but it only needs to exist because of the work that doesn't need to exist exists. So it's like we're stacking on all these things that don't need to exist. And it's this infatuation with work and like the importance of work for us as individuals, and the importance of meaning and how we need jobs to live. And we need to get away from that, and we need to, the focus needs to be that people should be free to do whatever they wanted to do before someone told them that they needed to go earn money to live. You know, it's like a twist on something Buckminster Fuller said.
Yeah.
um, that we need to make sure that people are doing intrinsically motivated work that they can do entirely unpaid work that could be care work, you know, it could be volunteering in their communities. I would say the work that really is the best work that anyone can do is the stuff that they want to do so badly and they feel is so important that it doesn't matter if they earn anything doing it. Like unpaid work is really extremely valuable. And the only way to reward or recognize unpaid work without actually interrupting and interfering with the psychologies behind it. Because again, if you start paying someone to do something that they're doing because they're intrinsically motivated to do it, you can actually destroy their motivation to do it. So this kind of the job guarantee angle saying that let's just pay unpaid workers for the work they do, like let's give salaries to moms and stuff for being moms, then that affects the motivation of it. We want to say, no, you're getting money because you're a human being and you have basic needs and rights, and not because you're doing something. But then because you have that, then you can do these things that are important to you. So I guess that's kind of my take on the job guarantee, is that I'm not against the idea of like jobs programs to have basic income, but I do think that there's really some things that are part of a job guarantee that we need to look at more seriously.
A jobs guarantee is clearly necessary when it comes to things like you said, you know, we need a public works program, New Deal style, particularly for infrastructure, you know, the plan inside the Green New Deal, that kind of thing. You know, in the long term, I was at an artificial intelligence conference in California last month. You know, and in the long term, it is there is broad agreement inside the artificial intelligence community. Inside, and by this, I'm talking about researchers. You know, I'm talking about those who construct them, programmers, software engineers, that we will achieve human level artificial intelligence, AGI. And that will in fact go beyond that. And so that means intelligent machines that are capable of all tasks that human beings are capable of, you know, and there's debate about exactly when that will happen. There's a general consensus about when it'll happen. Some people think, you know, it'll happen in the next couple decades. Some people think it'll take centuries. But the basic premise is that as that happens, there's less and less human labor that is required to produce and sustain the standard of living that we have. And in fact, it can elevate the standard of living that we have. And there is no, you know, and we should recognize the limitations. You know, I agree with you when you say this. We should recognize the limitations in our present model of thinking that labor is kind of one's right to life, essentially. Or labor, I would go further than that and say that it's labor that is attached to value by capital today, because that is the only thing that is paid for today, you know, by the private sector, is anything that private capital, you know, corporations ascribe value to and are willing to pay for, you know. And so that clearly is a dated model to me. And it's something John Maynard Keynes thought that we would be working 15 hours a day by 2000. You know, we're clearly our own model, our own models of employment, our models of work, our economic models are holding us back from being able to embrace, you know, all of the best qualities of life, you know, and those things that do motivate, you know, that you're most intrinsically motivated to do, you know, as well, like the work, for example, that I'm doing with the Movement for a People's Party, and that everyone else is doing, that you're doing for universal basic income. You know, this idea, and this is generally thrown around by the right, but that money or making money is the only thing that motivates people. That that is just patently untrue, you know, and it only applies externally, you know. So that might apply when you ask other people what motivates them, but nobody ever, if you ask them, says that they're motivated, you know. Oh yeah, if I had my basic needs taken care of, if I had an economic floor, I would do nothing. I would be lazy, you know. I would play video games all day, this kind of thing. That's just it's a complete misnomer. People have a desire for connection, purpose, mastery of skills, and that drives them. And so we can move to other things driving human beings, driving human productivity and advancement, and flourishing, beyond this necessity, this 20th century industrial model of necessity of trading, labor for income in the long term. And it just seems so, to me, it seems so clear that that's the direction that we need to move, because it enables people to be more human than they have ever been,
Yeah. Yeah, like I really like the thinking about this from like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs perspective, where just because you have your most basic needs met, it doesn't mean that you stop there. You just move up the pyramid. So once you have that level met, then you move up. That's level met, you move up. So you don't just stop. Say, oh well, I got that whole food and water thing set up, so I guess I don't need any love. I don't need any friends. I don't need any community. I don't need to master anything. I don't need to make myself better. I don't need to read or develop myself. All that stuff goes out the window because I have food. Like, no, it does not make any sense. So if we had a basic income and all that's doing is saying that, look, instead of starting at the bottom of the pyramid and trying to work our way up, to level 2 and beyond, then let's just start on level 2. Let's just make sure our basic needs are met. We have our basic security met. And so we start right there, and then we can actually pursue everything that's the most important to us as far as human relationships go and valuable work and, the things that are important to us, learning and creativity and creation, like all these things that drive us. We still want those things. In fact, I would argue that's the most important thing of all. I think that when you look at, say, people who are killing themselves and committing suicide because they are, depressed, that they feel that there's nothing worth living for, that a lot of it is because all they're doing is having their basic needs met. It's not, you don't kill yourself because you can't find food. You kill yourself because all you're doing is finding food, and that there's nothing else in your life that you feel there's purpose for. So that's really what I think as human beings drives us, is this sense of finding our purpose. Like, why are we here? Why do I exist? What is it that I should be doing? What am I not doing? What can I be doing that is beyond me, that's bigger than me? How can I best be remembered by everyone around me and gain esteem among the community and be remembered after I'm dead? Like, these are things that really drive people. And to your earlier point too, and I just want to tie this to the fact that yeah, we are ever more productive, and it's just going to get more and more productive thanks to these incredible things as far as artificial intelligence goes, and advancements in robotics and deep learning algorithms, and yeah, even beyond to when you're looking at generalized intelligence and whatever that will mean. But right now, it's crazy to think that we're almost 3 times as productive as we were in the 40s. But here we are, and in fact, we're working like harder than we were then. You could, the money that you earned in the 50s, you could have one person for an entire household and living like the American dream, and going to college for basically just you worked a part-time job for a summer and you can graduate from college. Like, it was easier to have a good life back then when we were less productive. So now we're so much more productive, and yet we're working harder, and it's working longer, and it's college is more expensive, and you're having to find new work, you're having to retrain more often, find new skills, and it's getting harder. And it's the exact opposite of the way that it should be. It should be getting easier. So when I talk about a basic income too, and I'm looking at the future, I'm saying that what we should do is we create a floor, and then as productivity rises, then that floor rises as well. So what starts out as a basic income right now of, say, $1,000 a month, when as productivity grows, that could be $2,000 a month, a decade or 15 years or something from now. It could be 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 by the end of the century. Like, we could continually grow that. And as we do, I think money the way that we look at money changes as like its significance as it becomes like something that we have enough of instead of something that we never have enough of. There's like an abundance mentality that takes place, and then you're no longer thinking of money as this like scarce resource. I think you can think of it more as a tool of like measuring resources and measuring, you know, what we can achieve and do and how much we trust each other, and then we can really get into new economies that you can look at. You know, why do we even have a monetary system? You know, why don't we think beyond that? What can we achieve? Can we reach like a Star Trek kind of setup? You know, how can we leverage technology to even go beyond even what we consider normal and standard and right now? You know, how do we get into post-capitalism and whatever other systems we can think of beyond that? You know, I think these doors open up through basic income, and that's just another one of those reasons why I think it's so important.
Yeah, well, you put it so well, Scott, and I want to thank you for joining us. It's been a
Thanks
great
for having
conversation.
me. Yeah.
And so you can find Scott. He's very active on Twitter. Scott is the editor at Basic Income Today and scottsantens.com as well. Any other websites you want to share, or Scott?
Yeah, just if you want to learn more, check out basicincome.org. And yeah, I'm on Patreon at patreon.com/Scott Santens as well.
Great. It's been a lot of fun talking to you. Thanks for coming on, Scott.
Thanks. Great talking to you too, Nick. Have a good one.
All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time.
Bye.